She never boarded that bus to Cleveland. Those 5 words would shatter a decade of lies and expose a betrayal so profound that it would rock the quiet community of Terre Haute, Indiana to its core. What began as a young mother's desperate attempt to build a better life for her daughter would end in the most trusted place she knew, a church family's home where screams echoed through the night, where innocence was silenced forever, and where the flames of a basement fireplace would consume not just evidence, but the very soul of a community. The autumn air hung heavy over Terre Haute, Indiana on October 12, 2011. Becca Lane, 26 years old, stood in front of her bathroom mirror, smoothing down her best white blouse. Today was different. Today might change everything for her and her 6-year-old daughter, Clara. The job interview in Cleveland represented hope, a chance to escape the cycle of minimum wage work that had defined her life since Clara's birth. Becca worked the night shift at a gas station near Highway 40, barely scraping together enough for rent on their small apartment in downtown Terre Haute. The Wabash River flowed just blocks from their home, its gentle current a stark contrast to the turbulent waters of Becca's daily struggles. Friends described her as resilient, with eyes that sparkled when she talked about Clara's future. She dreamed not of wealth, but of stability, a job with benefits, maybe even a small house with a yard where Clara could play safely. That morning, Becca carefully tucked her resume into her purse and prepared to drop Clara off with Walter and Helen Grant, a couple from Covenant Baptist Church. The Grants were pillars of their congregation. Walter served as a deacon, Helen led the women's ministry. They had volunteered to watch Clara during church functions countless times, and their warmth toward single mothers was legendary in the community. Becca felt blessed to have such caring people in their lives. Before we continue with Becca's story, I want to acknowledge something. You're here because these cases matter to you. If you believe these stories deserve to be told and remembered, subscribing to Cold Crime Stories HQ helps ensure we can keep investigating and sharing these important cases. And I'm genuinely curious, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Knowing our community spans different cities and states reminds me why this work matters. But if you're not ready to subscribe yet, that's okay too, just share your thoughts below about why. Your voice matters in this conversation. Clara Lane was a bright-eyed first grader with pigtails that bounced when she ran. Teachers at her elementary school near the Indiana State University campus adored her infectious giggle and the way she proudly showed off drawings of her and her mother. Becca was Clara's whole world, and the feeling was mutual. Every evening, despite her exhaustion from work, Becca would sit on their apartment floor helping Clara with homework, their heads bent together over multiplication tables and reading assignments. The bond between mother and daughter was unbreakable. Neighbors often saw them walking hand in hand to the nearby grocery store or feeding ducks by the Wabash River on Sunday afternoons. Clara's favorite game was restaurant, where she'd serve Becca pretend meals made from her toy kitchen set. These moments of joy illuminated their modest apartment, filling it with laughter that echoed through the thin walls. On that October morning, Becca knelt down to Clara's eye level in the Grants' living room. "Mommy will be back tomorrow night, sweetheart. Be good for Mr. Walter and Mrs. Helen, okay?" Clara nodded, already distracted by the coloring books Helen had spread across the coffee table. The Grants' home on Terre Haute's south side was spacious and welcoming, filled with religious artwork and the scent of Helen's homemade cookies. It seemed like the safest place in the world. Walter Grant, 58, worked as a supervisor at a local manufacturing plant. He was known for his firm handshakes and booming voice during Sunday morning greetings at church. Helen, 54, had devoted her life to homemaking and church service after their own children had grown and moved away. Together, they presented the picture of Christian hospitality, always first to volunteer, always ready with a casserole for grieving families. Becca hugged Clara tightly, breathing in the scent of her daughter's strawberry shampoo. "I love you to the moon and back," she whispered, their special phrase. Clara giggled and replied, "and around all the stars." It would be the last conversation they would ever have. That afternoon, Becca boarded a Greyhound bus to Cleveland with hope in her heart. The interview was scheduled for the following morning at a small accounting firm. It wasn't glamorous work, but it offered steady hours and health insurance, luxuries she'd never been able to provide for Clara. She clutched her return ticket, marked for Thursday evening, planning to surprise Clara with good news and maybe even a small toy from the Cleveland airport gift shop. But Becca never made it to that interview. Her phone went dead sometime during the night, and by Thursday morning, there was no sign of her. The bus ticket remained unscanned in her purse. She never boarded that return trip to Indiana. More chilling still, when Thursday evening arrived and Becca failed to appear, Clara was also gone from the Grants' home. The silence that followed was deafening. 2 lives, a devoted mother and her beloved daughter, had seemingly vanished into thin air, leaving behind only questions that would haunt Terre Haute for the next decade. When Elise Lane received the call that her sister hadn't returned from Cleveland, her world tilted off its axis. Elise had raised Becca after their parents died in a car accident when the girls were teenagers. She'd watched Becca struggle through her pregnancy, cheered at Clara's birth, and supported every decision her sister made to build a better life. The idea that Becca would simply disappear was inconceivable. She would never abandon Clara, Elise told the first police officer who would listen. Something terrible has happened. But her pleas fell on skeptical ears. The officer glanced at his notes: single mother, minimum wage job, history of dating troubles. It seemed to fit a pattern he'd seen before: young women overwhelmed by responsibility, choosing escape over endurance. The Terre Haute Police Department opened a missing persons case, but their initial efforts were half-hearted. Detective Michael Davies, the lead investigator, operated under the assumption that Becca had left voluntarily. He interviewed her coworkers at the gas station, asking probing questions about her state of mind and romantic relationships. The narrative began to form: troubled single mother abandons daughter and disappears. Within 48 hours of their disappearance, Elise was plastering missing person flyers across Terre Haute. Becca's kind face and Clara's bright smile appeared on every telephone pole and storefront window that would accept them. The flyers went up at Honey Creek Mall, on the Indiana State University campus, and at every bus stop along Wabash Avenue. Local businesses like the Tribune-Star newspaper ran the story, but coverage was minimal. The church community rallied immediately. Covenant Baptist organized search parties that scoured Deming Park, the Vigo County Fairgrounds, and miles of the Wabashiki Trail. Volunteers spent entire weekends calling out Becca and Clara's names, hoping for any sign of them. Prayer vigils filled the church sanctuary with candlelight and desperate pleas to heaven. But as days turned to weeks, the initial surge of community support began to wane. The searches grew smaller, the prayer vigils less frequent. Whispers began to replace genuine concern. Some church members quietly speculated that Becca's past relationships had caught up with her. Others suggested she'd been planning her departure for months, perhaps overwhelmed by single parenthood. The rumors found fertile ground in a community that preferred simple explanations to uncomfortable truths. It was easier to believe that Becca had made poor choices than to confront the possibility that something sinister had occurred in their quiet city. The whispers grew louder in church hallways and coffee shops: maybe she wasn't the mother we thought she was. Young girls these days don't know how to handle responsibility. Clara might be better off wherever they are. Each cruel speculation was a knife in Elise's heart. She watched her community, people who had claimed to love Becca and Clara, slowly turn their backs on the truth. The missing person flyers began to fade and curl at the edges, eventually disappearing altogether as newer announcements covered them. Detective Davies pursued leads that supported his theory while ignoring evidence that contradicted it. He investigated Becca's ex-boyfriends thoroughly but spent little time examining her last known location, the Grants' home. When Walter and Helen provided their statements, he accepted them without question. They were respected church members, after all. Surely they had nothing to hide. The Grants told Davies that Becca had called Wednesday evening, sounding distressed, saying she'd decided to take Clara and start fresh somewhere new. They claimed she'd picked up her daughter late that night while they were sleeping, leaving only a brief note of thanks. When pressed for the note, Helen tearfully explained she'd accidentally thrown it away, overwhelmed by emotion. Their story contained inconsistencies that a thorough investigation might have uncovered. But Davies was satisfied with their explanation, marking the case as a probable voluntary departure. The file was relegated to a dusty cabinet where it would remain untouched for years. As I share these details, I can't help thinking about the investigators and community members who gave up too quickly. These cases require persistent voices demanding answers. If you're someone who believes in keeping these stories alive, consider subscribing to our channel. We're committed to investigating cases others have forgotten. But if you have reasons for not subscribing, I'd genuinely like to hear them in the comments. Understanding different perspectives helps us serve this community better. Elise Lane refused to accept her sister's disappearance as voluntary. While the community moved on and the police closed their active investigation, she remained steadfast in her belief that Becca and Clara were victims, not willing participants in their own vanishing. Her grief transformed into determination, and her determination into obsession. Every morning, Elise drove through Terre Haute with a stack of updated flyers, replacing faded ones and posting new ones wherever she could find space. She haunted the police station, appearing weekly in Detective Davies' office with the same questions. Any new leads? Have you checked this? Have you followed up on that? Her persistence earned her a reputation as the grieving sister who couldn't let go. At home, Elise converted her spare bedroom into a shrine to her missing family. Walls displayed photos of Becca and Clara from happier times, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, summer picnics by the Wabash River. A bulletin board held every news clipping, every police report, every scrap of information related to their case. She maintained detailed journals, documenting every lead she pursued, every conversation with law enforcement, every sleepless night spent wondering what had really happened. The financial strain of her private investigation was enormous. Elise used her savings to hire a private detective, but after 6 months with no results, she could no longer afford his services. She took a second job to fund her search efforts, working days as a school secretary and evenings at a local diner. Every spare dollar went toward printing more flyers, placing newspaper ads, and following up on tips that inevitably led nowhere. Friends and extended family grew concerned about Elise's mental health. They urged her to accept reality and move on, but she couldn't understand how everyone else had given up so easily. If this was your sister, your niece, would you just stop looking? She'd ask, her voice breaking with exhaustion and frustration. The holidays were particularly brutal. Elise set places at her Thanksgiving table for Becca and Clara, leaving their chairs empty as a reminder of their absence. Christmas presents accumulated under her tree, gifts for a sister and niece who might never come home to unwrap them. Each birthday that passed without celebration was another year of stolen moments, another layer of grief that seemed to have no bottom. Meanwhile, the Grants continued their quiet lives in their Southside home. Walter maintained his position as deacon, leading prayers and organizing church fundraisers. Helen resumed her women's ministry activities after a brief period of recovery following the trauma of Becca and Clara's disappearance. To their congregation, they were the innocent victims of a selfish young woman's poor decisions. But subtle changes occurred in their behavior that only the most observant might have noticed. Helen stopped volunteering to babysit for other church families, claiming she was too emotionally fragile after what happened with Clara. Walter became more withdrawn during social gatherings, often retreating to corners where he could avoid prolonged conversations. Their once welcoming home was no longer open to the informal visits that had characterized their hospitality. A neighbor later recalled seeing smoke rising from the Grants' chimney on unseasonably warm nights in late October 2011, finding it odd that they would need a fire when temperatures were still mild. Another church member remembered Helen suddenly donating several pieces of furniture to Goodwill, explaining she was redecorating, though the items had seemed perfectly fine. These details would prove significant years later, but at the time, they were dismissed as the normal activities of a couple coping with an unexpected trauma. The community's trust in the Grants remained unshaken, their reputation as moral pillars intact. As 2011 became 2012, and 2012 became 2013, the active search for Becca and Clara officially ended. Detective Davies retired, taking his assumptions about the case with him. New officers inherited his files but lacked the context or motivation to re-examine old conclusions. The case was quietly transferred to the Cold Case Unit, where it joined dozens of other unsolved disappearances. The years that followed were a slow torture for Elise. She aged rapidly under the weight of unresolved grief, her hair going gray and her face developing lines that spoke of countless sleepless nights. Yet she never stopped believing that somewhere, somehow, the truth would surface. She kept vigils on the anniversaries of their disappearance, lighting candles in her front window and posting appeals on social media that reached fewer and fewer people each year. Terre Haute moved forward, building new developments and welcoming new residents who had never heard of Becca and Clara Lane. The missing person flyers became historical artifacts, occasionally discovered in forgotten corners of old buildings during renovations. For most of the community, the Lane family tragedy had become just another cautionary tale about the dangers of modern life. But truth has a way of refusing to stay buried forever. And in 2021, 10 years after Becca and Clara vanished, an unexpected discovery would shatter the silence and force Terre Haute to confront the dark secret that had been hidden in plain sight. Detective Ben Carter was 34 years old when he was assigned to Terre Haute's Cold Case Unit in early 2021. Unlike his predecessors, Carter brought fresh eyes and modern investigative techniques to cases that had been gathering dust for years. A former military investigator, he possessed both the analytical skills and the stubborn persistence necessary to breathe new life into seemingly hopeless investigations. The Lane file was one of dozens Carter inherited, but something about it immediately captured his attention. Perhaps it was the photo of 6-year-old Clara, her gap-toothed smile radiating the kind of innocence that demanded justice. Or maybe it was the inconsistencies in the original investigation that leaped out at him as he read through decade-old reports. Whatever the reason, Carter found himself returning to the Lane case repeatedly. The first red flag was the unscanned bus ticket. Every Greyhound ticket contained a barcode that was scanned when passengers boarded. According to transportation records, Becca's return ticket from Cleveland to Terre Haute had never been used. This meant she had never left Indiana, directly contradicting the assumption that she had fled to start a new life elsewhere. Carter spent weeks combing through the original case files, noting discrepancies that previous investigators had overlooked or dismissed. The Grant story about Becca calling to say she was leaving contained timeline inconsistencies. Phone records showed no calls from Becca's cell phone after Tuesday evening, yet the Grants claimed she called Wednesday night. Her phone had been powered off or destroyed by Wednesday morning, a detail buried in technical reports that Davies had never thoroughly examined. The detective also discovered that the Grants had made several unusual purchases in the weeks following the disappearance. Credit card records showed trips to a hardware store for industrial-strength cleaning supplies and a bag of lime, purchases that seemed odd for routine household maintenance. They had also rented a small storage unit across town, paying cash for 6 months in advance, though they claimed to friends that they were decluttering their home. When you're investigating a case this complex, you realize how many details can be overlooked when people want simple answers. I've spent countless hours researching these files, and I believe every detail matters. If you value this kind of thorough investigation and want to see more cold cases reopened, subscribing helps support this work. But I'm also curious, for those of you following along but not subscribing, what would convince you? Share your thoughts in the comments. Understanding what our audience wants helps us create better content. Carter's breakthrough came from an unexpected source, social media. While searching online forums dedicated to unsolved cases, he discovered a Reddit thread about missing persons in Indiana. Buried in the comments was an anonymous post from someone claiming to have information about the Lane case. The message was cryptic: the church people know more than they're saying. Check what happened to their basement. The detective tried to trace the post's origin, but the user account had been deleted immediately after posting. However, the message provided a crucial lead. Carter began researching the Grants' property records, discovering that they had done extensive renovations to their basement in late 2011, just weeks after Becca and Clara's disappearance. The work had been performed by an out-of-town contractor who had since gone out of business. Armed with this new information, Carter requested permission to reopen the Lane investigation. His superiors were initially skeptical. The case was over 10 years old, and the primary witnesses were respected community members. But Carter's presentation was compelling, highlighting the unscanned bus ticket, the suspicious purchases, and the timeline inconsistencies that had been ignored. In June 2021, Carter received approval to form a new task force dedicated to the Lane case. The team included forensic specialists, digital evidence experts, and FBI agents trained in cold case investigations. Their first step was to request a search warrant for the Grants' former residence, which had been sold several years earlier after Walter's death from a heart attack in 2018. The current homeowners were cooperative, allowing investigators to examine the property thoroughly. In the basement, forensic experts discovered traces of luminol-reactive material, substances that could indicate the presence of blood, even after extensive cleaning attempts. Soil samples from the basement floor contained microscopic bone fragments and teeth, carefully preserved despite years of attempted concealment. DNA analysis of these fragments would take weeks, but Carter felt confident they were on the right track. The anonymous Reddit post had been accurate. The basement held secrets that the Grants had desperately tried to hide. As evidence bags were loaded into police vehicles, neighbors gathered to watch in shocked silence. The house they had passed countless times, the home of people they had trusted and respected, was now the center of a murder investigation. Helen Grant, now 64 and living in a nursing home due to declining health, was brought in for questioning. Her initial denials gradually crumbled as Carter presented evidence of her and Walter's deception. The timeline inconsistencies, the suspicious purchases, the basement renovations, each piece of evidence chipped away at the story she had maintained for 10 years. The truth, when it finally emerged, was more horrific than anyone had imagined. The DNA results arrived on a cold December morning in 2021. Detective Carter opened the laboratory report with hands that trembled slightly, knowing that the scientific analysis in his grasp would either vindicate his investigation or send him back to square one. The results were unambiguous. The bone fragments recovered from the Grants' basement belonged to Rebecca Lane and her daughter Clara. After 10 years of speculation and false narratives, the forensic evidence provided irrefutable proof. Becca and Clara had never left Terre Haute. They had died in the basement of the house where they thought they were safe, killed by people they trusted above all others. Carter immediately drove to the nursing home where Helen Grant now resided. The woman who had once commanded respect as a church leader now sat in a wheelchair, her mind clouded by early-stage dementia but still lucid enough to understand the weight of what was happening. When Carter placed the DNA report on the table between them, Helen's carefully constructed decade of lies finally collapsed. The confession that followed was a harrowing account of paranoia, violence, and cover-up that shook the investigative team to their core. Helen revealed that Walter had been embezzling money from the church for years, skimming donations and falsifying financial records. When Becca returned early from her Cleveland trip, having decided the job wasn't right for her, she accidentally discovered financial documents Walter had left scattered on his desk. Becca's discovery of the embezzlement set off a chain of events that Walter couldn't control. Panicking at the possibility of exposure and prison, he confronted Becca in the basement, where he kept his illegal financial records. The confrontation escalated when Becca threatened to report what she had seen to church leadership. Walter struck her with a heavy object, killing her instantly. Clara, awakened by the commotion, came downstairs looking for her mother. The 6-year-old witnessed Walter standing over Becca's lifeless body, and her screams of terror convinced Walter that he had no choice but to silence her permanently. Helen, paralyzed by shock and fear, watched helplessly as her husband murdered the child in cold blood. The cover-up that followed was methodical and chilling. Walter and Helen spent the next several days dismembering the bodies in their basement, using tools from Walter's workshop. They burned clothing and personal effects in their fireplace, the unusual smoke that neighbors had noticed during those warm October nights. The bone fragments and teeth were pulverized and mixed with concrete, which Walter used to repair cracks in the basement floor. The Grants had then constructed an elaborate deception, claiming Becca had called to say she was leaving town with Clara. They donated furniture that might have contained DNA evidence, renovated the basement to eliminate any remaining traces, and continued their lives as if nothing had happened. For 10 years, they attended church services, participated in community events, and maintained their reputation as moral pillars of the community. Helen's confession was recorded and witnessed by Carter's team and FBI agents. As she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, as if the weight of carrying this secret for a decade had literally stolen her breath. She repeatedly expressed remorse, claiming she had wanted to confess many times but feared Walter's reaction. She described years of nightmares, of seeing Clara's terrified face in quiet moments, of carrying guilt that had eaten away at her soul. When I think about the courage it takes to finally tell the truth after years of silence, I'm reminded why this work matters so deeply. Every case we investigate represents real people whose stories deserve to be told completely and honestly. If you believe in the importance of this mission, subscribing helps ensure we can continue this work. And for those who haven't subscribed yet, I'm genuinely interested in your perspective. What stories matter most to you? Share your thoughts below. The arrest of Helen Grant sent shockwaves through Terre Haute that were felt far beyond the city limits. News trucks lined the streets outside the nursing home where she was taken into custody, their satellite dishes reaching toward gray winter skies that seemed to mirror the community's mood. The woman who had once organized charity drives and led prayer circles was now facing charges of accessory to murder and conspiracy to conceal a crime. Local media struggled to process the revelation that two beloved community members had been living a lie for an entire decade. The Tribune-Star ran a front-page story with the headline, "Trusted Church Leaders Hid Decade-Old Murder," accompanied by photos of the Grants from happier times, Walter in his deacon's uniform, Helen surrounded by children during a church picnic. The contrast between those images and the mugshot of the frail, elderly woman now in custody was jarring. Churches throughout the region grappled with the theological and practical implications of the revelation. How could evil hide so effectively behind a facade of righteousness? What did this say about their ability to discern character and trustworthiness? Pastors found themselves fielding difficult questions from congregants who wondered if they really knew the people sitting beside them in the pews. Elise Lane received the news of Helen's arrest while she was at work, a phone call from Detective Carter that she had waited 10 years to receive. The mixture of vindication and grief was overwhelming. She had been right about her sister's fate, but the confirmation brought no joy, only the bitter satisfaction of finally knowing the truth. "I never stopped believing that Becca and Clara deserved justice," Elise told reporters gathered outside her home. "My sister was a good mother who loved her daughter more than life itself. She would never have abandoned Clara. Never." The words came between tears that she had been holding back for a decade, a flood of emotion that represented years of suppressed anguish. The community's reaction was complex and often contradictory. Many residents expressed shock and disbelief, struggling to reconcile their memories of the helpful, generous Grants with the horrific crimes they had committed. Others admitted to having sensed something off about the couple in recent years, though they acknowledged they had never suspected anything as sinister as murder. Some church members felt betrayed not only by the Grants' actions but by their own failure to see through the deception. How had they been so easily fooled? What signs had they missed? The questions were particularly painful for those who had helped spread rumors about Becca's character, who had suggested she was an irresponsible mother who had abandoned her daughter. The guilt extended to law enforcement as well. Detective Davies, now retired, issued a public statement expressing regret for the assumptions that had shaped his initial investigation. "We failed Becca Lane and her daughter Clara," he admitted. "We allowed preconceived notions about single mothers to cloud our judgment, and as a result, justice was delayed for far too long." The Terre Haute Police Department announced a comprehensive review of all cold cases involving missing women and children, implementing new protocols to prevent similar investigative failures. The Lane case had exposed systemic biases that had allowed a brutal crime to go unpunished for a decade. Helen Grant's trial began in the spring of 2022, drawing national media attention to Terre Haute. Court TV provided gavel-to-gavel coverage, and true crime podcasts dedicated entire series to dissecting the case. The courtroom was packed daily with local residents, journalists, and members of the extended Lane family who had traveled from across the country to witness the proceedings. The prosecution painted a picture of calculated deception, presenting evidence of the Grants' systematic cover-up and decade-long lie. Phone records, financial statements, and Helen's own recorded confession formed the foundation of their case. The defense argued that Helen had been a victim of her husband's manipulation, too frightened to speak up or seek help. Expert witnesses testified about the psychological dynamics of long-term concealment, explaining how the burden of keeping such a devastating secret could affect mental health and decision-making. However, the prosecution countered that Helen had actively participated in the cover-up, making conscious choices to preserve her comfortable life at the expense of justice for two innocent victims. The trial lasted 6 weeks, with Helen appearing increasingly frail and confused as proceedings continued. Her dementia had progressed to the point where she sometimes seemed unaware of her surroundings, adding a surreal quality to the courtroom drama. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on charges of accessory to murder after the fact and conspiracy to conceal a crime. At sentencing, the judge acknowledged Helen's age and declining health while emphasizing the gravity of her crimes. "For 10 years, you allowed a family to suffer, not knowing the fate of their loved ones," he stated. "Your silence prolonged their agony and denied Becca and Clara the dignity of a proper burial. While the court recognizes your advanced age and medical condition, justice demands accountability." Helen Grant was sentenced to 15 years in prison, though medical experts predicted she would likely die in custody given her deteriorating condition. She showed little reaction to the verdict, staring blankly ahead as bailiffs prepared to escort her from the courtroom for the final time. The resolution of the Lane case brought mixed emotions to Terre Haute. Justice had finally been served, but it came at the cost of shattering illusions about their community's safety and moral foundation. The revelation that trusted church leaders had been capable of such evil forced residents to confront uncomfortable truths about judgment, assumption, and the hidden darkness that could lurk behind familiar faces. As news crews packed up their equipment and the media attention moved on to other stories, Terre Haute was left to rebuild its sense of community and trust. The Lane case had changed them permanently, serving as a stark reminder that evil could wear the most convincing disguises. In the months following Helen Grant's conviction, Terre Haute began the difficult process of healing and reflection. Memorial services were held for Becca and Clara Lane, finally giving the community an opportunity to properly mourn the victims and celebrate their lives. The services were attended by hundreds of residents, many of whom had never met the mother and daughter but felt compelled to honor their memory. Covenant Baptist Church, where the Grants had been such prominent members, struggled with questions of complicity and responsibility. Had they been willfully blind to signs of trouble? Should they have asked harder questions when Becca and Clara disappeared? The congregation split over these issues, with some members leaving to join other churches while others committed to staying and working toward healing. The church leadership implemented new safeguards for child care and background checks for all volunteers. They also established a memorial fund in Becca and Clara's names, providing financial assistance to single mothers in the community, a gesture that some saw as meaningful while others criticized as inadequate given the magnitude of the betrayal. Elise Lane found herself in an unexpected position as a public advocate for missing persons cases and victims' rights. She began speaking at conferences and working with law enforcement agencies to improve their approach to disappearance investigations. Her message was consistent: listen to families, don't make assumptions based on stereotypes, and never stop searching for the truth. "My sister and niece can't be brought back," Elise said during one such presentation. "But maybe their story can prevent other families from enduring what we went through. Maybe it can save other lives." The case had lasting impacts on investigative procedures throughout Indiana and beyond. Police departments revised their protocols for missing persons cases, particularly those involving women and children. The assumption that voluntary departure was the most likely explanation was replaced with more thorough initial investigations and longer retention of evidence. Detective Ben Carter received commendations for his work on the Lane case, but he remained focused on the dozens of other cold cases still awaiting resolution. The success with the Lane investigation had provided valuable lessons about the importance of re-examining old assumptions and utilizing modern forensic techniques. The house where Becca and Clara died was eventually torn down by its current owners, who could no longer bear living in a place where such horror had occurred. A small memorial garden was planted in its place, with a simple stone marker bearing the names of the victims and the inscription, "In memory of Becca and Clara Lane, beloved sister, daughter, mother, and child." Helen Grant died in prison 18 months after her conviction, her dementia having progressed to the point where she no longer recognized visitors or understood her circumstances. She was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery, her death barely noted in local media. The woman who had once been praised for her Christian charity and community service ended her life as a forgotten footnote to a much larger tragedy. The story of what happened to Becca and Clara Lane became part of Terre Haute's collective memory, a cautionary tale about the dangers of blind trust and the importance of questioning comfortable assumptions. Parents became more vigilant about where they left their children, and communities across the region began implementing stricter oversight of volunteer programs. As I conclude this investigation into the Lane family tragedy, I'm struck by how many people had to fail for this crime to remain hidden for so long. From law enforcement officers who made assumptions to community members who spread harmful rumors to church leaders who didn't ask hard questions, the system failed Becca and Clara at every level. If you've stayed with us through this difficult story, you understand why it's so important to keep investigating these cases and demanding better from our institutions. Subscribing to Cold Crime Stories HQ means supporting thorough, uncompromising investigations like this one. But if you have concerns about our approach or suggestions for improvement, please share them in the comments below. This community's input makes our work stronger and more impactful. The legacy of the Lane case extends far beyond the borders of Terre Haute, Indiana. It serves as a reminder that evil can hide behind the most trusted faces, that assumptions can be deadly, and that the pursuit of truth requires persistence, courage, and an unwillingness to accept easy answers when lives are at stake. For the families of other missing persons, the resolution of this case provided both hope and frustration. Hope that cold cases can be solved with modern techniques and dedicated investigation, but frustration at how long justice can take when initial investigations are flawed or inadequate. The story of Becca and Clara Lane is ultimately one of love destroyed by greed and evil, but it's also a story about the power of persistence and the importance of never giving up on the truth. Their memory lives on not only in the hearts of those who loved them but in the reforms and improvements their case has inspired. In a world where people disappear every day and cases go cold with alarming frequency, the Lane investigation reminds us that every victim deserves a voice, every family deserves answers, and every case deserves the thoroughness and attention that can make the difference between justice and injustice. Thank you for joining us on this difficult but necessary journey through one of Indiana's most shocking cold cases. If you believe these stories matter and want to see more investigations that honor victims and demand accountability, please consider subscribing to Cold Crime Stories HQ. Your support helps us continue this vital work of keeping these cases alive and fighting for justice, no matter how long it takes. We'll see you in the next episode, where we'll continue shining light on the cases that others have forgotten, ensuring that no victim's story is ever truly cold.